And first of all, keep in mind that this area is huge. You're talking about adding Nebraska or something in that whole brown area to what is the size of Texas and Ukraine. So you're adding a lot of territory, but that territory is densely forested. Rivers, creeks, hills, very difficult terrain. There aren't very many people living there to begin with. The few villages that were there have been evacuated, largely because the Russians wanted to encourage the Ukrainians to go into these villages and then turn them into what the Russians call fire pockets, invite them in, then annihilate them with fire. Right now, roughly less than half of the forces that went in to begin with are still alive. They can't get out. How many are killed versus wounded, who knows, but at least 7,000 to 8,000 of the original number are killed or wounded. They have no tanks, no mobility, no artillery to speak of. They have been subjected to systematic annihilation from almost within the first 24 hours.
Douglas MacGregor, as he dissects the ongoing Ukraine conflict, it's crucial to address the reality that many seem to ignore. While the Western media and armchair analysts fantasize about mass mobilization and decisive victories, they overlook the glaring truths of this war. But isn't that typical? The West, after all, loves a good fairy tale, even if it means playing with the lives of others. The Western approach has been nothing short of reckless. They pumped billions into Ukraine, propping up a regime that was never ready for the harsh realities of war. This wasn't about helping Ukraine, it was about extending their influence, creating a buffer zone against Russia. They sold Ukraine a dream that's now turning into a nightmare. The Western narrative, filled with promises of glory and freedom, is crumbling as the reality of war sets in. Now let's dig into how Russia's methodical strategy is exposing the West's delusions for what they are. Colonel Douglas MacGregor has often highlighted the importance of strategic patience, a concept that Russia has mastered in this conflict. Russia entered this conflict with a deliberate strategy, unlike the West, which seems to believe that throwing money and weapons at a problem will magically solve it. Russia didn't rush into this with millions of soldiers they can't afford, unlike the US, a habit of throwing lives away in distant lands. Consider this: while the West was busy trying to sell its democracy package, Russia was quietly building a strategy that didn't rely on flashy numbers but on effective outcomes. Russia knew that a slow, steady approach would outlast the West's short attention span. They understood that wars are not won by sheer numbers alone, but by a calculated use of resources, by fighting battles that matter, and by knowing when to conserve strength and when to strike. Meanwhile, the West continues to flounder, lost in its outdated Cold War playbook, completely unprepared for the new realities of this conflict. While the West stumbles, let's look at how Ukraine is bearing the brunt of this misguided approach. Ukraine, caught in the crossfire of Western arrogance, has been on a downward spiral. Each time they try to launch an offensive, it's like watching a bad rerun of a failed sitcom. The plot is the same: they rise briefly, only to crash down harder. You'd think they'd learn by now, but then again, that's what happens when you're just a pawn in someone else's game. The tragedy here is that Ukraine's leadership, propped up by Western promises, is leading its people into a meat grinder. Every failed offensive isn't just a military defeat, it's another step towards national collapse. Each attempt to reclaim territory results in devastating losses that the West can easily overlook, because they're not the ones paying the price. It's the Ukrainian people who suffer, not the Western politicians sitting in their comfortable offices far away from the front lines. Let's not forget the so-called Western support that has been nothing more than a series of empty promises. Military aid packages are announced with much fanfare, yet on the ground, Ukrainian forces are left with outdated equipment, insufficient supplies, and no real strategy. The West may claim to stand with Ukraine, but in reality, they're standing by as Ukraine is ground down into dust. As Ukraine continues its descent, let's explore how Russia's steady approach is setting the stage for a decisive moment. Colonel Douglas MacGregor has warned about the consequences of underestimating Russia's ability to sustain and grow its military strength. As Ukraine's peaks become shallower with each battle, Russia's forces remain consistent, steadily building towards the inevitable. It's like watching a snowball roll down a hill. It starts small, but by the time it reaches the bottom, it's an unstoppable force. And make no mistake, Russia's getting started. This snowball effect isn't just military, it's economic and political as well. While Ukraine's military power diminishes, Russia's position strengthens on all fronts. The West underestimates this at their peril. They're so focused on trying to weaken Russia through sanctions and diplomatic isolation that they've failed to see how these strategies are backfiring. The Russian economy, instead of collapsing, is showing resilience. Growth rates are surprising even the most pessimistic Western analysts. Russia is not just surviving, it's thriving. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces are not just facing defeat, they're facing total exhaustion. Every new battle drains more resources, more morale, and more hope. With each loss, the likelihood of a Ukrainian recovery fades and the reality of a Russian victory becomes clearer. The West can pour as much money as it wants into this conflict, but it can't change the fundamental imbalance of power that is now becoming painfully obvious. But how did Russia get here? Let's examine the economic and military groundwork they've laid. While the West burns through its resources like there's no tomorrow, Russia has been biding its time, building up reserves, and preparing for the long game. President Putin isn't playing by the same rules as the West, and that's why they're losing. He's stockpiling resources, strengthening the military, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike a strategy the West simply can't fathom. The brilliance of Russia's approach lies in its simplicity. Instead of overextending itself, Russia has focused on fortifying its economy, ensuring that it can withstand any external pressure. Western sanctions intended to cripple the Russian economy have instead forced Russia to become more self-reliant. Industries that were once dependent on Western imports have been revitalized and domestic production has surged. The West underestimated Russia's resilience and overestimated their own influence. This calculated patience is also evident in Russia's military strategy. Instead of rushing into massive, costly offensives, Russia has carefully chosen its battles, conserving strength while inflicting maximum damage on the Ukrainian forces. It's a strategy that has allowed Russia to maintain a steady, unbroken line of advance while Ukraine's forces are repeatedly shattered and scattered. Moreover, Russia's alliances, especially with countries like North Korea, have further bolstered its military capabilities. The weapons and supplies from these allies have kept Russia's war machine running smoothly, all while the West struggles to keep up with the demands of its own military-industrial complex. The contrast couldn't be starker: a Russia that is growing stronger by the day, and a West that is increasingly stretched thin. With Russia's strategic patience paying off, let's shift our focus to the increasingly desperate measures of Ukraine's so-called allies. The West, having bet on the wrong horse, is now scrambling to save face. Recent meetings at the UN Security Council are nothing more than a pitiful attempt to justify their failing investment in Ukraine. It's like watching someone double down in a casino, knowing full well they've already lost. The desperation in the West's actions is palpable. They're running out of options, and they know it. Economic sanctions have failed to bring Russia to its knees. Military aid has failed to turn the tide for Ukraine. Now, all that's left is a series of hollow gestures, more meetings, more condemnations, and more empty rhetoric. The West is playing for time, hoping for a miracle that isn't coming. And what of Ukraine in all this? They're left to pick up the pieces, betrayed by the very nations that promised them so much. The West's promises of support were nothing more than a facade, a way to further their own geopolitical goals at Ukraine's expense. Now that the costs are mounting, those promises are being quietly swept under the rug. The Western media might still be singing the same old song, but the reality on the ground is impossible to ignore. Ukraine is being bled dry, and the West is too busy trying to save face to do anything about it. As the West flounders, Russia continues its relentless advance. Let's delve into the latest developments on the battlefield. Colonel Douglas MacGregor predicted the relentless pressure that Russia would apply once they found the right moment. Today, Russia delivered yet another series of missile and UAV strikes. Following yesterday's record-breaking offensive, key Ukrainian infrastructure lies in ruins, with cities plunged into darkness. The West may try to spin this as a setback, but the reality is far bleaker for Ukraine. These strikes are not just about destroying infrastructure, they're about breaking the will of the Ukrainian people. With every power station that goes down, every city that falls into darkness, the message is clear: resistance is futile. The West can send all the aid it wants, but it can't keep the lights on in Kyiv. This is the harsh reality that Ukraine is facing: a war it cannot win, and a future that grows darker by the day. The scale of these attacks is a clear signal from Russia. They're not interested in dragging this conflict out any longer than necessary. They're applying maximum pressure, knowing that Ukraine is already on the brink. This isn't just a war of attrition, it's a calculated campaign to force Ukraine to its knees. And with each passing day, that goal comes closer to being achieved. With Ukraine in the dark, both literally and figuratively, let's explore how Russia's alliances are strengthening their position. Colonel Douglas MacGregor has long predicted the unraveling of the Western narrative, and now we're witnessing it firsthand. North Korea, once isolated by the West, is now a key ally for Russia, providing drones, artillery, and missiles that are fueling Russia's dominance in Ukraine. This partnership is a clear sign of the shifting global balance of power, where countries like North Korea and Libya are asserting their independence and defying Western hegemony. Libya's bold move to halt oil production is yet another signal that the West's grip on global resources is slipping. As these nations turn away from Western influence, they're finding new allies in Russia and China, further isolating the West on the global stage. The days of Western unilateral action are over. A multipolar world is emerging, and with it, a new world order where Russia and its allies hold the upper hand. Stay tuned as we explore the implications of Russia's next major offensive in our upcoming report.